Hello and welcome to Russia in Focus. This month we concentrate on sanctions. Don't know if you're aware, but in June the EU released the 14th round of sanctions, so it's a good idea to have a look at the history of it. Because there are a lot of sanctions to go through, I have sort of collected them from various sources, mainly EU official sources, and clubbed them up and reduced them and condensed them into a table. So let's have a look at this table, and you have to remember that the sanctions that were placed on Russia in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea are still in place. So it's a lot of sanctions, and the 2022 sanctions cut really deep. And let's count them. It's the easiest way to graph them, kind of. So we count them out for every year. You see, from 2014, I counted about 7 types of sanctions imposed on Russia, and they remained there until 2021. In 2022, the first round of new sanctions starts being applied. The old sanctions have been tinkered over time. People have been added to the individuals on the sanctioned list, but fundamentally they haven't radically changed. So let's visualize it a bit better. So just plotting the counts in bar charts, we can see this is first round, the first 2014 set of sanctions. This is the 2022 set of sanctions. So it's worth looking at how the sanctions may or may not have affected the Russian economy. A quick way to do that is to look at the GDP growth rate. So we do that. The data comes from the IMF. And of course, tabular data is fantastic, but this is not very helpful. So let's plot it again in a bar chart. So we have got the sanctions, and we can see that in 2014, the economy was, GDP growth wasn't great, but it was still going. By the time the sanctions took effect, GDP took a dive in 2015. It wasn't until 2017 that it began to recover. Remember that these sanctions, compared to these sanctions, are really not very many and not very well defined. Anyway, we see the pandemic here with the deep dive in GDP. That's the same across the board, no matter where you are. Then 2022 GDP takes a dive, but interestingly, unlike in the previous round of 2014 war, GDP recovers rather quickly. So let's find another indicator, which is inflation. If we find the inflation rate for Russia, we can see how it spiked in 2014 and then slowly start coming down. Again, it spikes, but not as high in 2022, and it comes down a lot more rapidly than previously. We can see that if we add all up the sanctions imposed since 2022, we end up with 68 in my count. This is a rough idea to tell you that it's a lot. It's not in any way, shape, particularly accurate. It's just an indicator, just a way to get an intuition of the difference between the number of sanctions imposed in 2014 and what we have applied on top of those since 2022. And yet, when we go back to inflation and GDP, we have a much quicker recovery. My argument is that in 2014, the Central Russian Bank and the businesses were not really ready to deal with sanctions. However, that has changed. I think this, I would argue, suggests that in 2022, strategies and a framework have been put in place to deal with the sanctions. We have gained an intuition of how the sanctions have affected the Russian economy. Now let's see how the sanctions may have affected the sanctioning countries, i.e. the people imposing the sanctions. So we look at the EU member states. And let's look at GDP first. GDP in 2022 was good growth, but we have to remember this is coming out of the pandemic, and there was a bit of a, everybody was rearing to go and start working, living, doing things again. Then 2022, Russia decides to invade Ukraine once again, and in 2023, these are the GDPs. Now, I would say that most economies in Europe took a dive. However, most European economies have regained some of their losses. They are in growth territory again. If I look at this, recovering GDP growth figures, which is not far off from what is going on in Russia. If I add to it the head of the Bank of Russia, Verner Bulina, statement that business in Russia has developed strategies and a framework to work with the sanctions, my argument would be European businesses have learned how to work with the sanctions too. Over time, the impact of sanctions is bound to get diluted as both sides learn how to work within the new framework. It is possible that European businesses have found new trading partners, but I am not convinced, and I'll show you why. If we look at this and we look at inflation, this is the inflation rates for the European member states. Even eyeballing you can spot the pattern, but let's do it properly. Let's throw some machine learning at it. I'm using the K-means algorithms. It's out of the box, I haven't tinkered with it. And we just load the data. The algorithm inside K-means is supposed to find if the data can be grouped. And it does that by calculating the distance between and among all the data points. Right, and I've run it, and then you do a scatter plot traditionally to see all, where the data goes. So, done that, and you see this. This bunch of states are over here, this bunch of states are over here. The separation is reasonable. And if you're curious about it, it gives me a score of 0.7. The range for the K-means is from 0 to 1. So 0.7 is a reasonably good result. Of course, I haven't tinkered. You could improve it, but I don't see the point. Well, it's a bit more fun is put these results on a map. And let's look at the map. And let's see. Let's just look at the states I've considered, which I've colored in. Right. One group is the green-blue group, and then we have the yellow group. So let's put some names on it. And we can see these other countries with consistently higher inflation. If it looks familiar, it's because in the olden days, this was called Eastern Europe, and it was aligned with the Soviet Union. So even if some of the states have been members of the European Union for over 20 years, their economies are still very exposed, I would argue, to the Russian economy. This is why I would argue that, yes, new trading routes can be found, but new trading partners are not found overnight. So, in Russia, we trust. They showed us the way, and we are taking their lead. Low or negative GDP growth coupled with high inflation is not sustainable. It has social and political repercussions. Consistent high inflation really hurts, and I am of the opinion that it was one of the triggers of the cost of living crisis, and among other factors, this is behind social and political events that are unfolding now in Europe. The neoliberal, internationalist, dominant political position is being challenged both from the right and from the left. Hurting the Russian economy will help Ukraine in the long run. But if in the meantime the states supporting Ukraine and their economies get so weakened and their political and social situation becomes unstable, that will hurt Ukraine. Weak economies cannot support the Ukrainian effort. So it's a catch-22 situation. Of course, that's just my opinion. And you can look at this data and come to a different conclusion. You're more than welcome to do so. These are the results for June from the Levada Center. And Putin approval rating is still going strong. And let's map it. President approval rating, we can see it's doing rather well. Approval for the government, still doing well. And let's do the moving in the right direction, which is quite useful. Oops. Yeah, doing quite well. So the regime is still strong, and negative responses are stable. Overall, people still support the actions of their government. Anyway, that concludes my monthly update for Russia in Focus. My weekly videos are completely different. They are about places I visit or events I attend or things that I just find interesting and I think you'll enjoy too, and I like to share them with you. The weekly videos, generally speaking, come in English, Italian and Bulgarian. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.